Hello and welcome to Goom's Open Source Podcast. And today we want to further the agenda of persisting our data and securing it. As you well know that local storage is susceptible to deletion or corruption. So after a given time, we need to find a solution of how to further persist our data. And to that end, we go to our last two episodes, these being among them, where we are creating a function to synchronize our data from local storage to a remote backend storage. So in our last episode, we will build that backend bit using Node.js and storing the data in SQLite. For today, we want to build a function that synchronizes our trips from the local storage to the backend server. So the idea is to keep track of trips that have not been synchronized and send them to our cloud storage. So we will be doing a little bit of Ajax. We will do fetch requests to the backend server. So what we will do is creating a function that keeps track of the trips that are in the local storage and also running that function at a particular interval. So let's get to it. So from our JavaScript file, the main.js, where we left, we will add a function and we will call it function sync to backend. We are still following our convention of using snake case to name our functions and variables. Now, as I said, we are going to be tracking. We will have to track we will have a mechanism to track trips that have been sent to our backend and persisted there, and the trips that have not been persisted. Remember, we are assuming that every minute, every second, there are bytes that are being taken and returned. So there are trips that are commencing, there are others that are completing. And since we have a status, let me just go back to our trip object. So this is when I say trip, for those of you who may not have watched the previous videos, this is the entity that we are talking about. Now, this trip has a status, trip status, but how do we keep track of the behavior of synchronization? So for that, we are going to add another attribute here and call it synced. Yes. So by default, I would want to give it a default value. This will be false, so that when you're initiating a new trip, by default this is false. And then when we successfully send the unsynced trips to the backend, we will mark that as true and update our local storage. So without further ado, let us just continue. I think I made a typo. No, just call it synced. No, it's after all, it's not a grammar lesson. Synced. Yeah, that looks better. So just call it synced that way. So we'll be working with this variable now, synced, to keep track of the synchronization state of a trip. So let me go back to the end of the file. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to declare a variable that stores all the trips that are not synced, that have a synced status as false. So we'll say unsynced So remember, we have our global array of trips. So let me just show you where I'm getting the trips. So remember, we have, let me see. Remember, at the very top, we have our trips array. This is what will store all the trips, whether it's complete or not complete. And when you, for example, when you start a trip, you populate this data structure for us. So let me just show you. When you start a trip, you see we are pushing that trip to the trips array. And now the only thing that we will do for completing the trip is just updating this array and pushing it to local storage. So we are working with the trips array. So let me go back. So what we'll be doing, we will just be filtering trips.filter. And what do we want to filter? We want to filter, so we are on the lookout for a trip where the trip status, first of all, is complete. So we are only interested with the completed trips, so that these are the ones we have computed everything, the duration, the cost, and we want to further store them in a persistent backend that is not local storage. So we are saying the trips that are completed and the trip that whose synced status, you see, trip.synced is false. So if it's falsy, then we need that. So those are the unsynced trips and the trips that are completed. Now, so we'll be checking whether we have anything there. So we'll say if unsynced dot length. So we want to see whether that the array that we get has, if the length is 0, then we stop execution. Otherwise, if it has anything, then we proceed with our logic. So if that length is 0, then what do? We just kill execution, we return. Otherwise, let us just, for the sake of testing on our end, because we're not building the backend in this episode, I'll just do console.log, and then I'll add a string here, syncing to backend, yeah, then some ellipses. I think that's okay. Let me just add a comment here. That we will not see the comments. It is just, if it works, then we will have to remove the console.logs. But I like working with the console because it shows me whether I'm headed in the right direction, or if I have an error, what could it be? So I like working with the console. Now, we are going to send a request, an AJAX request. We're going to do a fetch request to our backend, and we're going to use the fetch API from JavaScript. Now, we're going to have a URL for the backend, and let me just declare it at the top. So I'll just do control home and field where we have the storage key. It's a constant. So this will be the backend URL. So just call it API URL. Give it the value of HTTP. I can type. Then we say localhost /API/sync. Just give it a port here, port 3000. We will assume, remember we're going to create a Node and Express web server that we'll be using. Let me not call it web server, I'll just call it backend application for storing our trips that are complete and not synced. So that's the variable. So what have I done? Okay, that's okay. I've done a Control Z, do a Control N, and I'll go back to where I was. So let's define our fetch function. So it will be fetch. So it will have two components. So the fetch will always have a URL and now the options we have for our request. So this will be a post request. We are sending data to the server. So we'll have an input, the request info or URL, and then we'll have to initiate the request. It's always good to look at the documentation of these things. Do not assume when I explain something that you need to take the information as the gospel truth. It's good. In fact, the MSDN, Mozilla Developer Network, and see what the fetch method does, because we are learning here. Now, they say the fetch method interface starts the process of fetching a resource from the network, returning a promise, and we shall see how the promise works. That is fulfilled once the response is available. So have they explained the syntax? Yes. So you can see fetch resource or fetch resource and options. So for us, we will have a couple of options, and that is what I want us to do. So I'll go back and I'll say, so the first option is our resource, which is our URL, the API URL, and then we will define our options. So our options, this will be an object. It's an object. Now we will have, it's a request that we are making. So we could say this is method, and the method that we're using is post. Post is suitable for sending data to a server. If we were fetching from the server, then we would say do a get request. If we were updating something from this end, we would say put, right? So so let's say then we'll have headers. We'll have to have headers. So headers is an object also, and the kind of data we'll be sending will be a JSON object, a JSON string. So say that we have to specify the content type. So the content type, this is JSON. Say yeah, so that's the only header. Then the other thing that we will do, we will have a body. So now this is the content that we are sending. We are sending a JSON string. So that now on that other end, we will ensure that we are going through, we are converting it into an object and looping through as we insert on our SQLite table. So that will be very interesting when we go to the backend. So the body here will be JSON.stringify. You remember we are stringifying. Let me just complete this. JSON.stringify unsynced, the unsynced data. So what we get at this point at the top is a JSON array. It's a basic array, a JavaScript array, and we cannot transmit that via JSON. We have to convert it into a string. You cannot just stream an array, so you have to convert it into a string send it and then decode it on that other end. You have to pass it now on that other end. So therefore, that's why we are using JSON.stringify and just ensuring that we are sending a string. So at that point, then when we make that request, we should get a promise. So how we deal with promises, so we'll say .10, then we'll say response. So we'll get a response object. So that's the promise now. So we'll get the response object, and then we want the JSON version. So we'll say the response converted to JSON. So it's a function, so we have to call it. After that, then we have to also receive another promise, and we'll say then. So we'll get now the JSON data at this point. So the data. So ideally now from our backend, we will be returning a positive message that this has been successful, and this will show on the developer on the front end that this synchronization went as expected. So what we'll do at this particular point, where we are finally receiving the data, the response data now. Let's just do a console.log, and we're just telling the user on this other end that the sync was successful. And maybe the other information that we are getting is data. So that's it. And then remember we said if this works as expected, then will be required for all this data that we sent in the trips array. We will need to update our local storage and ensure each of the entries there is marked as synced. So let's do that. So we'll have to loop. We'll say unsynced.forEach. So for each ensures that you work with each instance of your array or object. So what we'll say for each trip, what you want to do is ensure that the trip dot synced equals to true. Now we have updated the status of the synced attribute for each trip. And then what we will do, remember we have a function that updates our local storage. We will say update trip in local storage, and then we will pass the trip that we are working with inside that loop. So that should do it for us. The other thing we should probably look at, if all this process failed, and we didn't get our promise, the promise did not resolve. And if you're not familiar with promises, probably you could ask me in the comments to do a little episode on promises. I mean, this is how now we deal with asynchronous data. So for instance, if we had any error, we need to be able to catch that error. So inside our promise, our last promise, that is where we'll bring in a .catch. So in that catch we'll get an error. We expect an error, and then so at this point when we are saying catch, the promise we could say resolves with an error, but it doesn't yield a result. It's basically an exception at this particular point, and for that it would be adequate if we just did a console log and we say error syncing, I don't know why I'm adding a H, syncing to backend, and then we could also display the error. Yeah. Or if you want it to be more meaningful, it's just a variable. We could just say error there and error here, so that it's meaningful to everyone. So we're done with our function, and hopefully it works successfully. Now we want to ask ourselves, yes, we've done that function, but how will it operate? We need to set an interval. So you could say, for example, you want to sync your trips to the backend after every 5 minutes, or you could say after every 20 seconds or 60 seconds or whatever. But I mean, for demo purposes, I mean, if I was in a production environment, I would probably do that after every 5 or so minutes, so that I'm sure I'm not overwhelming my system. Remember, it's a very simple system, but we need to build also prudence into the way we work with our system. We don't want to overwhelm our backend also. So what I'll do now, we'll add an interval. That is what I want to do. I want us to add an interval for running that particular backend. So just before we start our trip, I think it's much better if we did it under load from local storage. So remember, when the application is initiating, we load everything from the local storage. So after we load, I think that is when we should be able now to start saying that we want to also start our syncing interval. So what I'll do, I'll say set interval. So I'll set an interval. What, I already have a function. Yeah, it's okay. So I already have my own function. So you see, the way set interval works, you'll have a function that runs and then the interval itself. So we have already defined our function. So I'll just remove. If we had not defined it at the end of the file, then we would have an opportunity to define it directly inside the set interval. But for, I mean, keeping the code neat, let's just do our function separately and call it, invoke it in the interval by name. So this will be sync to backend, yeah, that way, and then we'll have the interval. So the interval could be in milliseconds. Let me just define a constant for that, and I'll call it sync interval. Then let me do sync interval here. So that should do it. Yeah, that should do it. Now let's say I wanted to do the syncing after every 5 seconds. Then how I'll do it, or let us just first look at how it's behaving on the browser. Let us run our function here using the Go Live plugin. So we should be seeing messages here as it runs. Let's go to console and see whether we have any errors. Let me just take this to another browser and see whether we are getting any messages. So I'm in a Chrome-based browser. Let's see the console if we have anything. So as you can see, now the console.log is reaching out to our URL. So you can see connection refused. So this is what we want for our system. So these are the messages, the console.logs that we did, syncing to backend, but we need to do a more realistic sync interval. So as I was saying, if I needed to do for 5 minutes in milliseconds, so 5 minutes, I'll say 1 second will have 1,000 milliseconds. So I'll begin by working with 1 minute times the number of minutes I want to work with. So I'll say 60 seconds multiplied by 1,000. See, since 1 second is equal to 1,000 milliseconds, and then I'll say the number of minutes actually, so times 5. So that should change our narrative now. As you can see now, we are not seeing continuous intervals, continuous invocation sync function, because we have added the interval to 5 minutes. So after every 5 minutes, it will perform a fetch function to our backend. So we are yet to do that backend. In our next episode, we will delve into Node.js and Express, and we will see how to do a backend in JavaScript also. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I would want to thank you for the support. Many of you have reached out, you have asked us questions. We've been able to explain them, and to the best of our abilities. So this is just but the beginning. If you would want us to speak about any web development concept, we are here to help. We are here to learn together. And with that, I beg to bow out for now. So remember, we defined, just to recap, we defined the sync to backend function. We did an interval, we defined an interval, and for this maybe I could comment for 5 minutes. So the interval is running for 5 minutes. So we said if it is 5 minutes, then we need to start thinking from each second. So each second, a minute has 60 seconds, yet a whole second has 1,000 milliseconds. So if we are working with 1 minute to scale it to 5 minutes, what we will do is multiply the number of minutes, the number of seconds in 1 minute multiplied by 1,000, which is the value that shows the number of milliseconds per second, and then the number of minutes you want to work with. Now, having defined the interval and our synchronization function, we do an interval. The set interval method is defined in JavaScript. It's a native function to JavaScript. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. Thank you.